Okay, now we're going to talk about element binding. The element binding is a little bit different than data binding because data binding is binding UI to view model. Element binding is binding UI to UI. So let me show you how that's to be done. So we'll leave this guy there and we will put up a text block. A text box. Text box is a text block you can edit. So let's click that, put it at the top of the screen, and we'll actually move it around a little bit. Let's grab it, move it to here, stretch it out, and then we'll also grab a slider. Here we go. I'll drag a slider out right here. Okay, so I have a slider that has values that when you drag it right and left, it should be able to update itself because it has its own property called the value. Then we have the text box that has a text field. So I'm going to bind this one to that one and back and forth. So first we'll do the slider. Okay, so what I want to do is have this text box show the value of the slider. So I'll go to the text box and I'll click on its text property and we'll go down here and say element binding. I'm going to point to the slider and I want to point to the slider's value. So go down here and choose value and there it is, click. I notice immediately it updates to 0 because the slider is at 0. So if I go to the slider and I change its current value from 0 to, let's say, notice, see how I'm moving it? It's updating. Even in the designer we'll see that it's updating, so I can put it at 5. So now these two are hooked together. If I run this application, you can see that it runs both in the designer and in real life. We get the binding from here to there. Now what if I want to go the other way around? What if I come here and I type in 0 tab? Notice that it's a two-way binding. This is kind of the default. So if I set it to 8, it jumps to 8. This two-way binding is by default. We could set it to a one-way binding. You do that by going back into the binding and we go into here to one way. So come in here, element binding, this guy, go to value, open up this drop down, go one way here. Now run it. So I can update this slider, updates the text box, but the text box does not update the slider. So that's how you have, that's the mode. If you look at the actual XAML for it, you'll see here we have binding is to value, and the element name is slider. So it named the XAML object. See how it has a name here? So we're saying bind to the value from the element slider and their mode is one way. I can change this to two-way, or I can just delete it, and deleting it's the same as saying two-way because that's the default. So there's the way to bind it through UI, and here's the way to bind it through code. You bind to the value, comma, and the element name is slider. And we could use any element name in the visual tree. Name any element, and you can bind right to it. That's quick element binding. You can bind any property on an object. You can bind across each other. So you can have the slider bind the opacity of an object, or its X position or Y position. You could have a text box bind to colors. You name it. If you have objects that interact with each other, you can have that interaction done all in XAML and never go to code. That's pretty cool.